What drives one person to violence and another to peace? What works to reduce violent behaviours in conflict areas? Welcome to the Breaking Cycles of Conflict mini-series for the War Studies podcast, where we share our groundbreaking research on how traumas can drive violent and peaceful behaviour in conflict zones. This research is being carried out as part of the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence, Policy and Trends Research Programme, otherwise known as CEPT, which is a UK international development funded project that aims to inform policies and programmes that support long-lasting peace. In this episode, Dr. Nafis Hamid, Dr. Rahaf Al-Douli, Niels Malik and Broderick McDonald share insights from their research interviewing Syrian rebel fighters both before and after the fall of Assad.
In December 2024, the Assad regime in Syria was overthrown. A rebel alliance led by Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, seized Damascus, effectively ending 50 years of brutal rule by the Assad family. Today, the leader of the now dissolved HTS, Ahmad al-Shara, is acting as the interim president of Syria, with the promise that a transitional government will be formed to build the institutions of the new Syria. But who are Syria's new rulers? What do they want? What new Syria are they building? And can this new society hold together? I'm Dr. Nafis Hamid, the co-PI and Research and Policy Director of the CEPT Research Project at King's College London. Joining me today to discuss these questions are Dr. Rahaf Al-Douli, lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University, Niels Malik, Research Fellow on the CEPT Project, and Broderick McDonald, Associate Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation. So first of all, I want to explain a little bit on the background of this research and why we decided to study the so-called Syrian rebels. For years, I've been involved in research with militant armed groups around the world. And one thing that I and my colleagues have noticed is that governments, and to be honest, specifically Western governments, take a very rational view of who these militant groups are and how they think. And what I mean by that is there is a perception that many of these groups weigh costs and benefits in a very sort of material carrots and sticks way. So if you want a militant group to acquiesce to your desires, all you have to do is get the carrots and sticks right. Threaten them with enough war, with enough bombing, with prison time, or if it's leadership in a government, threaten them with sanctions. And if you want to persuade them, on the other hand, offer them foreign aid, trade deals, economic incentives. And if you can get that material carrots and sticks right, you can get them to do pretty much whatever you want them to do. But of course, many of us instinctively know that this is not the way many militant groups around the world work. Now, my colleagues and I have studied groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and these are groups who are willing to give their lives for their beliefs. There's no stick big enough to persuade them or to dissuade them. What we found is that they're motivated by something called sacred values. These are moral values that are of the utmost importance. These are the values that they are willing to fight and die for. And so as a result, they aren't really rational actors in the way many governments may look at them. Instead, they're devoted actors, devoted to a cause and to a group, and are willing to sacrifice their lives for it. Previously, we've studied the PKK, Peshmerga, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and in my current role as Research and Policy Director of CEPT, I commissioned this research to study the Syrian rebels a little over a year ago. This was a group of people who had been largely put on the back burner, if you will, in terms of people's policy interests. The world had moved on to focusing on other conflicts, and people weren't really paying attention to groups like HTS. They just saw it as some small militant group hiding out in the northwest of Syria. Then along with some colleagues of mine like Angel Gomez, we decided to focus on many such groups, such as the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, the FARC in Colombia, and Islamist groups in the Philippines. And of course, to everyone's surprise, we did not expect to see what happened last December, with HTS now overthrowing the Assad regime and taking control of Syria. At this point, we have over 200 surveys and qualitative interviews with members of different groups that now make up Syria's new leadership. We have psychometric measures on them, as well as deep understandings of what motivated them to join, as well as those who left the group. And so I'm here to talk with my colleagues who've been doing this research with me to discuss some of our findings, what they mean, both scientifically as well as what the implications are for policy. So I'm going to just open up and throw out to the group, what do we know from all of these interviews, from all of these surveys? What do we know about the motivations of these rebels? Rahaf, I know you've been talking to them. You are Syrian yourself. You've been to Syria. You just came back not too long ago. You've been interviewing so many different people, leadership, rank and file, people who were part of HTS and SNA and other groups. Can you just give us a very broad overview of their motivations?
Hi, Nafis. Thank you for that introduction. Actually, that's pretty much before the 8th of December was more of a straightforward answer, maybe, after researching SNA and also meeting and interviewing some of HTS fighters for the last 3 years. Actually, it was a straightforward answers in terms of how I would characterize the basic or the main drivers for violent behavior or for joining armed groups. Actually, it became clear that their motivations are complex, fluid, and shaped by both personal experiences and also collective identity. These motivations were never static, they evolved as the conflict unfolded and as fighters actually navigated the shifting political and military landscapes. I would say their motivations can be understood by examining the different phases of the Syrian conflict. For example, if we identify the first phase, which is, I called it the revolutionary phase between 2011 and 2015, during these early years of the uprisings, motivations were primarily driven by political grievances related to repression, marginalization, and the regime's authoritarian control. And I think fighters in this phase joined various factions, ranging from moderate groups advocating for political change to more of an Islamist factions with religious and ideological objectives. Notably, I would say that the Islamist groups often focused on recruiting fighters who supported the establishment of more of a religious or an Islamic state, while others were motivated by sectarian tensions, particularly in areas where Sunni communities faced violence from regime forces and allied militias. I would say that in this phase, we have more of the conceptualization or the establishment of what we call a sacred value. So it's the phase where the sacred values became more central to the motivations of these fighters. Now, mobilizations during this phase was also characterized by emotional responses to personal loss, displacements, and collective suffering. Now, if we come to the second phase, which is more, I think, was very pivotal and related to the fragmentations of the military landscapes, which is between 2015 and 2018. Here we can see that motivations has shifted towards more of material gains, and we see the formation of SNA, of the Syrian National Army, with its various factions and various corps. As we know, SNA was organized within 3 major corps. Here we see more of the main motivations can be described as instigated by identity fusion, which is a psychological process where their personal identities became more of inseparable from their group identity. However, with another bunch of or a coalition of military groups in the second corps within SNA, they were more driven by material incentives, and also the material benefits offered a sense of stability. Though some fighters expressed frustration with corruption and privilege enjoyed by some commanders. Now, also motivations were shaped by tribal networks, particularly among fighters from the First Corps, where loyalty within these groups was rooted in asabiyya, which is a form of collective solidarity based on kinship ties and regional or territorial identity. Now, I think the third phase, which is between 2018 and 2000, up to the fall of Assad regime, I would say motivations shifted to be more pragmatic and more focusing on survival. Here, I think the opposition forces or the armed factions largely consolidated within these factions like SNA and HTS. We see the mergers and here pragmatism, even prior to the fall of Assad. I would say 2 years before the fall of Assad, we see motivations or drivers shifted towards more of survival and focusing on the sacred value of overthrowing Assad. And here I think motivations shifted to more of a pragmatism. So I would say from emotions to fusion and then to motivations more driven by pragmatism.
I think what you're highlighting there, Rahaf, is just how complex of a picture is actually emerging on the ground. And not only how much differences you see in people's motivations depending on what group they're associated with, but how their motivations, even within a group, change over time. So I think one of the central sort of motivating questions, both before and definitely after the fall of Assad, is really about how strong is this alliance? There's potential for fragility. Different groups have very different motivations, different political ideologies. Some are more Islamist, some are more nationalist. But there's also points of cohesion amongst them too, right? They are to some degree right now cooperating with each other. So I'm really curious, Broderick or Niels, if either of you want to jump in here. Can one of you talk a little bit about both where the fragility is as well as where the potential cohesion is?
Yes, thanks, Nafis. So I think we can actually learn some very interesting insights based on the quantitative as well as the qualitative interview research that we've conducted over the last year, both before and after the offensive that started in December. But I actually think to answer the question of does it have a chance of succeeding this new government, this coalition of very different groups, as we've outlined, it actually helps to look back for a moment and look at how they have even succeeded so far and how strong of a coalition this has been to this day. And so in our research, we found multiple different motivations, and Rahaf even outlined an even more complex situation where these things can change over time, and then also differing between certain groups of people and rebel groups as well. But a few things that came out relatively consistently among the people that we researched in these rebels groups were that external motivations, by and large, didn't predict and directly explain people's engagement in the revolution. Of course, exceptions apply, and there may be, as we've heard, some groups that are more motivated by these things as well. But what are external motivations? So these are things like material incentives, but also direct social influence, like whether or not your friends are already active, is there social pressure by a particular community? People themselves said that this didn't really play a big role in their initial decision to join the revolution and also to maintain their engagement with a particular group. Instead, the two things that we found was first a very strong sense of moral determination, and going along with that, a strong sense of collective injustice. This primarily relates to Assad. So we found 94% of the people we studied in the rebel groups had unconditional and absolute opposition to Assad, which is rather unsurprising because they were, of course, actively fighting against him and his regime. But these people even said that this is an unconditional value. And we know from other research that Nafis, you mentioned in the introduction as well, is predictive of people's willingness to make extreme personal sacrifices in pursuit of that political goal. So very strong perception of injustice relating to this and other things relating to the revolution. And then also a high degree of pragmatism, at least more recently, as Rahaf has outlined. And this is a belief that they can actually right these injustices by fighting and taking collective action. It's also noticeable that people were very motivated by and sensitive to a particular group's effectiveness, so how effective a particular group was seen in the fight to achieve these goals. And then another thing that I find quite fascinating that came out of our study was that the moral integrity, perceived moral integrity of particular leaders within rebel groups, and this doesn't have to be a high-level leader. It can be a very immediate kind of commander in a particular fighting group, for instance, played a big role, to the point where people were very ready to leave a group at various points in time over the course of the revolution if they felt that a leader was losing their moral integrity. And so we have this moral determination and a high degree of pragmatism. And I think this partly explains why these vastly different groups with different ideology, different backgrounds, and partly different goals even, were able to coalesce around their common enemy, which is the strong primary goal of removing Assad, and were so effective in ultimately launching and coordinating this offensive that we've seen. But then it also raises a few interesting questions. So what does this mean now that Assad, their primary source of motivation, if you will, has been removed from the equation? We have according to our research, this group of rebel fighters, many of which are now emboldened with knowing that they can actually get things done and achieve their goals by taking up arms and fighting for their goals. And we know that there is a high degree of pragmatism, but also a strong sense of injustice. So actually, I would like to put that question back to you, Brody and Rahav, with your expertise and insights on what these other grievances might be and what risks they pose now to the stability and the future of this coalition.
That's right. What I find so fascinating about this is what we saw in our survey data and our interview data is now playing out on the ground in many ways. So you spoke about this common enemy that brought the coalition together as it marched towards Damascus and ultimately overthrew Assad and ended, more than 50 years of rule by that family. Once Assad was removed, there was a very practical issue of what becomes the new motivating goal and what is the common enemy. What we've seen in the last few weeks is that while you can never replace symbolically and practically what Assad represented as a common enemy for Syrians, governing a country is very difficult, almost more difficult than just capturing a country. And so, all kinds of different issues have emerged. The job of uniting Syria is not over yet, and there is a rush of new challenges to solve. We see, incursions by Israel. We see other countries interfering in Syria. So there are a range of different new goals that the coalition really needs to coalesce around. And I think that helps them to maintain stability.
Thanks, Niels and Brody, for that. Rahav, I'm really curious. I mean, you've been on the ground until very recently talking to people. Can you give us your insights on this question?
Well, thank you very much, Nafis, and thanks to Niels and Brody for highlighting some of the very important points regarding this alliance. And I think I'm taking this from my positionality as a Syrian academic and as a Syrian as well. I think from my recent interviews with central commanders just one day before the victory speech, actually it shows that this alliance between HTS and SNA is both pragmatic and fragile. And we need to remember that there is a story behind this alliance even before the fall of Assad on the 8th of December. Now, my interviews with high-ranking or top ranks within HTS before its dissolvement on the 29th of January, they told me the story that this alliance that we are seeing today is shaped by earlier collaboration, which and also was more or less influenced by evolving power dynamics and complex regional influence. Now, historically speaking, like SNA factions and HTS were always operating independently, and often there were clashing due to ideological and territorial differences and rivalry among these two groups. And so even if we call it like now, we have a more of a revolutionary phase or revolutionary moment. That's the transformational for these central commanders within SNA to forget all of these past rivalry between SNA and HTS. And that moment is essential and also actually was pretty much used in a smart way or a clever way by al-Shara to call for this alliance. However, seizing this opportunity of this revolutionary moment is not enough to build more of a stable and cohesive alliance, if I would say. Actually, from my recent interviews with central commanders, they commented on this process of alliance as both shaky. There is lack of transparency in terms of restructuring the Ministry of Defense. There were feelings of mistrust or lack of trust and concerns about political marginalization. I think for this alliance, it could have been much better if all of these kind of concerns were addressed by the Ministry of Defense, such as there were comments about the fear of accountability for wartime violations. Many faction leaders, for example, expressed apprehensions regarding potential legal repercussions for human rights violations committed during the conflict. So here we are talking about transitional justice. Often, transitional justice is always kind of discussed when we are talking about the political process or the transitional political process. However, this is a very important topic for central commanders because they fear how we can balance the demands for accountability with the necessity of reconciliation, actually to prevent renewed violence or the transformations or the remobilizations of these armed factions and into a potential spoilers in the future. There is also the need for institutional trust building. And I think here the MOD or Ministry of Defense failed actually to promote genuine military integration, like establishing a revolutionary military council consisting of also central commanders from the southern factions and also SDF. I think if these initial steps were followed by the Ministry of Defense or Al-Sharia leadership, this could have actually minimize the risks of spiraling into another cycle of violence in the future. But I would still think that the alliance is still shaky and fragile, and we need to think about what's the national narrative that would pull all of these different various factions that have been fighting within these armed groups for the last 14 years. So we think to bring back the notion of what's our national narrative, what's the army's national narratives, what's the concept of sovereignty. Also, this is very important, and also and how I think transitional justice is something very important that needs to be discussed among also these military groups. One last point I think that's essential is to remember that while the integration happened and the dissolvement happened, these armed factions are still positioned in their old positions and within their same fighter spaces. So real integration did not happen till now, but just, I would say, accessory dissolvements of these armed factions.
Thank you, Wolf. I want to highlight something and kind of shift a little bit to talking about leadership in particular. One of the main findings that we found from the survey, and Niels alluded to it earlier, which is we talked to people who had left or who had disengaged from the revolution. Some of them had left their groups entirely. Some of them just pulled back from frontline fighting. But there was this kind of disaffection that we found. And when we asked them to give their reasons for their disengagement, the number one reason that came up was a perception that their leaders had lost moral integrity. They lost their confidence in their leadership. They no longer perceived them as having integrity. And it was, for many of them, especially those in the SNA groups, that perception was contributed to by a feeling that their leaders had been bought off, that there was foreign influence that was coming in, and that their leaders were essentially not really devoted actors anymore. They weren't really motivated by the sacred values of the revolution. But now they were beginning to think in more self-interested and instrumental terms. And this led to sort of an erosion of people's trust in their leaders, and therefore a disaffection that grew within them. Now we're in a point where Western governments are trying to influence the leadership. And naturally, they're going to think, and again, in this very sort of material carrots and sticks way, right? They're going to think, how do we use things like sanctions? How do we use things like trade deals? How do we use things like foreign aid to see if we can nudge and influence and maneuver Syria's new leaders in the direction we want them to go? But of course, this is a double-edged sword, because while it may have influence, it could have the unintended consequence of eroding people's trust in their leaders, which could then undermine the entire coalition and could lead to a lot of potential infighting. On the other hand, if you don't provide enough material sort of well-being for society, that can also lead to infighting, right? If people feel like they don't have enough food, enough shelter, their economy is bad, while there may be a current moment of euphoria right now that Assad is gone, ultimately people will start to have grievances building up again. So this creates a difficult situation. Of course, all four of us wrote an article together in Foreign Affairs about how to engage with Syria's new rulers. And we found a way to kind of finesse this point. And our argument was essentially give tens of billions of dollars for reconstruction efforts, give money for humanitarian aid, alleviate the suffering, provide economic stability as much as you possibly can. But don't use it as a leverage. don't use it to strong arm leaders to acquiesce on contentious sacred values, because that can actually lead to more infighting and fissures within the coalition. But nonetheless, this perception of leader integrity is still, it's really, I think, at the heart of whether cohesion can continue to manifest within this coalition or not. Brody, I want to bring you in here. If you can speak a little bit to the importance of perceptions of moral integrity of leaders, people's, but just generally, what are the perceptions? What are the varying perceptions people may have and their attitudes towards leaders, and sort of the downstream effects that will have on the success of this revolution?
Yeah, it's a really important point because this came up again and again in interviews with fighters from various groups. If individual fighters perceive their leaders as having lost credibility or lost their sort of moral grounding, have sold out, or abandoned their principles, this leads to both divisions and infighting, insurrections, but ultimately it leads to instability, which is what all of us want to avoid in Syria. And I think that when we look at Syria now, the first part of it was about getting massive amounts of humanitarian aid to Syria. And of course, there's been huge challenges with that alone, just looking at cuts to things like USAID, which is not just providing food and water and other essential services to Syrians and millions of people around the world, but also even providing security for some of the camps that are guarding IS members in eastern Syria. So that, there was already huge challenges in terms of getting humanitarian aid in. But we call for much more of that. We also, as you pointed out, Nafeez, know that Syria needs tens of billions of dollars to rebuild. And we think that there are specific ways that governments can engage in a more nuanced way than Western governments often have. So, for instance, we argue that there are particular approaches that are likely to backfire. These are things like coercive investment deals. If they enrich a leader and then cause them to lose credibility, or if they sell off an important national asset, say a coastline or a area that is protected, as we've seen from countries nearby Syria just in the last few years. These kind of coercive, credibility destroying transactional deals can oftentimes really harm the credibility of leaders. We also know that if leaders are perceived as more interested in pursuing the goals of an external country, particularly if that country is funding the salaries or directly paying fighters of its preferred proxy group in Syria, that can also heavily undermine the credibility of both leaders and groups. And this is intuitive because the main goal for the Syrian rebels is to rebuild Syria now. First it was to topple Assad. Now it's to rebuild Syria and create a new vision for what Syria is going to look like. But if they're pulled in fighting for a foreign country in other places, or pursuing the goals of a foreign country at home rather than the interests of Syrians, that fundamentally undermines the stability and the integrity of these leaders and their groups. So we really call for a cautious, nuanced approach that focuses more on measures which are not going to undermine the stability. So this can be things like opening embassies if governments deem that is an acceptable level of tolerance that they have. We argue for signing memorandums, also lifting sanctions, because this isn't just about measures that look nice on paper. It's about getting real investment. And we actually have seen the European Union announce that it's lifting sanctions on particular sectors of the Syrian economy, which is a very positive sign. And this is, again, a way that governments can engage without undermining the credibility of leaders, but also allowing for significant aid and investment to come into the country. I would also mention, though, the EU sanctions don't go far enough. They only target specific sectors. And more importantly, we haven't seen any action by the United States to lift sanctions that were placed on Assad. I want to emphasize this point because these are sanctions that were not targeted for the new coalition or the new government that is now in Damascus. These were placed on Assad, somebody who is now thousands of miles away. And it's also not just about the kind of internal security of Syria. It's also oftentimes in the interests of countries like the United States or the EU, if we want to speak about supranational bodies, to engage with Syria's leaders by lifting sanctions and really negotiating that now in this critical phase. And I say that because we've already seen Russia and China and other countries that are traditionally thought of as adversaries of the United States and others start to engage in Syria and have phone calls with the leadership, travel to Damascus, meet, try to form new relationships with them. And so there's a real risk here that if the West, broadly defined, does not take this opportunity to engage with Syrian people and find ways to support the redevelopment of Syria through things like lifting sanctions, for instance, often we will come across cases where its adversaries sneak back in. And these are countries which are much less reliable. Russia has bombed Syria for 14 years. Obviously, other countries have very questionable human rights records. We don't want to see that be the future of Syria. We want to see true engagement with the European Union, the United States, and others as they come together and put forward a series of measures that can engage with the new government in a responsible way that doesn't undermine credibility, but ultimately allows for significant rebuilding of Syria, which will be needed in the months ahead.
I think that last point is exactly right, because we find consistently in our research, both the quantitative, robust data that we've collected, as well as across these interviews, what people keep telling us is that moral integrity and this perception of like how your leaders behave matters. But it's very crucial that one doesn't make the wrong conclusion from this, that there shouldn't be any engagement, because that can also undermine leaders' trust as, being ineffective, etc. So it's not the case that foreign leaders and Western leaders, broadly speaking, shouldn't engage with Syria. It's about doing it the right way and finding smart ways of conducting effective and constructive diplomacy based on how these dynamics work politically.
I think what Brody, Niels, what both of you are saying is something that is not only backed up by our data and our observations, but it's also backed up by general research having been done in even other conflicts, which is the role of sort of symbolic concessions. One of the main things that we find is that when you try to use material incentives to negotiate or get someone to trade off on their sacred values, it leads to a backfire effect. What tends to work a lot better is symbolic concessions. Now, symbolic concessions can take a variety of different forms. It could be statements made by leaders, which have to be, first of all, made by leaders. They have to be sincere, they have to be unequivocal, and they have to be followed up by actions. But nonetheless, the symbolic concessions opens up a door of negotiations and goodwill. But it can also just be through things like information sharing, intelligence sharing. Again, these are signs of goodwill. You're not using it as necessarily leverage. What you're doing is you're showing cooperation. You're showing, I guess in a sense, you could say friendship. You could take sort of language that we use on an interpersonal level and elevate it to the level of nations. Just like with people, you need to build goodwill. You need to build trust interpersonally. And nations also tend to have a similar psychology as well. You need to show that you're a reliable partner. And all of that can build trust not only between leaders, but then ultimately give leaders a sort of remit from their population to continue to engage with that other country, because they can then show their people, look, there is goodwill coming here. They are making concessions towards us.
And I think, Nafis, if I can come on this, I think you are completely right in terms of how the language of that nations is used among themselves. And that's exactly the point. And I think Al-Sharia actually sees that kind of symbolic concessions and use that kind of, and again, I would call it the revolutionary moments that was assisted as well by the symbolic concessions of like characterized by the diplomatic visits of many Western countries. And that actually assisted al-Sharia in pressuring other factions to join. But there was the window to use that kind of symbolic concessions to make more, or to work towards more of a stable integration of all factions. I think as time passed now, those symbolic concessions will be read negatively by other factions who haven't joined yet, as that these are only symbolic concessions. The economic hardships is still there. And I think al-Sharia, that window, the time frame of that window for using those symbolic concessions to pressure, for example, Ahmed Aoudeh to more make of constructive deals to integrate, has passed now. We are more or less now moving towards facing the real challenges. And I think we all hear Netanyahu's kind of statements regarding protecting the Druze, which tells us that there will be lots of complications in the negotiations between Damascus and the Druze or Suwaida in the coming weeks or months regarding joining the army. So that's also how these nations build trust with the new leadership, and whether this is only symbolic or moves beyond this kind of symbolic concessions towards like more of a practical and pragmatic cooperation is also important to look at.
And so while we're on this topic of symbolism, I guess Ahmed al-Sharia himself is a symbol, right? He is both a leader making pragmatic negotiations with different parties, but he symbolizes something. And so I was wondering if anybody here wants to speak a little bit to the figure, the personality of al-Sharia, what he represents, and how is that changing since, the fall of Damascus till today? How much is his charismatic authority, how much does that play a role in both the successes and the challenges for Syria?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I think Sharia is a really fascinating character. This is somebody who I've studied for a long time. And of course, we don't want to downplay or discount his personal history and his past, both in Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then IS, and then, HTS being affiliated with both of these groups at various times before breaking. Certainly, HTS and Sharia, or Jolani as he was known back then, was absolutely a member of the global jihadist movement. But of course, a lot has changed over the last 8 years, and not just words. We've also seen how they've governed in Idlib, showing at least some signs of positive engagement with minorities and with moderating and becoming more pragmatic. And I've often viewed this as partly a process by which HTS started as al-Nusra, and it at that time contained a lot of foreign fighters, a lot of hardliners. As the conflict went on, as the civil war went on, the percentage of hardliners and foreign fighters within their group steadily declined. And then there was also an influx of Syrians, local Syrians, Syrian nationals, to the organization, both through mergers, takeovers, and consolidation as HTS really gained control over the northwest of Syria. And through that process, the group became something different than it once was. And I think that arguably Sharia became something different than what he once was. Now, the question is, of course, what will he do in the future? And none of us, nobody on earth can predict exactly how somebody will act, in the future, particularly once they're secure and they feel empowered. So there are still questions, and we need to be cautious, certainly, about all of those things. But there's a really interesting academic point here about charismatic authority, as Max Weber spoke about. And I think in particular, what I find interesting about this is what role can the figure of Sharia and whatever support he has within the country, how far can that go in terms of keeping this coalition together? We know that charismatic authority is a powerful force. It's hard to measure, it's hard to define, but it is a powerful force, and it could play a role in helping keep this coalition in a cohesive, stable manner. And we've seen, he had success with this in Idlib and in northwest Syria to a certain extent, not a sort of complete success in every way, but we have seen that his personality and his status as the leader of first HTS, now that it's dissolved, the new government and arguably the new Syrian military, will be an important thing to watch going forward. And I think that we shouldn't discount the role that charismatic authority can play in any post-conflict zone. I think it's a very, very important factor and something that I'm going to be watching carefully over the next coming weeks and months as we see this coalition evolve and change.
I think I would love to come on the charismatic point, and I thank Prodi and Nafis for bringing this up, and I totally do agree with Prodi on this. Like, while also that we need to look at Ahmed Shara charismatism with a cautious point of view, I think, while also admitting that his leadership is often framed through the lens of charisma. However, it's not totally, if we know Al-Jawlani's past, his authority is not solely derived from the personal magnetism, but also from a calculated strategy of containing, diluting, or eliminating his rivals. And we've seen this strategy prevail in the last few years. However, I want to point at, and also to derive this from my recent interviews with central commanders from SNA, who despite their the sense of rivalism or antagonism or past kind of mistrust towards al-Shara or feelings of uncertainties, however, they all confirmed his charisma, that al-Shara is charismatic, he is capable at this moment to lead this coalition and integration. However, I think we need to point out that here also I have noticed a sense of despair among SNA factions because they are aware of Turkish role in actually sidelining any charismatic leadership among SNA groups. So, and that's actually that kind of hesitance or lack of sometimes calculative decisions from Turkey for the last 4 years in their strategies to restructure some of the SNA or sideline some of charismatic leaders among SNA. All of these kind of factors gave Ahmed al-Shara a more of a centralized role in leading or in showing that he is the only charismatic leader in Syria now. I think while this is an asset and shows liability of al-Shara, however, I think we need also to think about his ability to institutionalize authority beyond the figure of al-Shara only. Without this transition, for example, the current government risk replicating the same vulnerabilities that have undermined other revolutionary movements in comparable cases, where only we have to think that what if the sudden removal of a charismatic leaders, how this would lead to internal fragmentations and loss of direction. So while Ahmed al-Shara's influence and his charismatic can be essential for these coalition or holding the army together, but this also can highlight a potential vulnerability in the future if he was ever played a less role or if something happened.
Yeah, I just want to add one other interesting point on this issue of charismatic authority. We saw something very surprising in the days and weeks after the fall of the Assad regime. The new government, HTS-led government, put out a decree very early on, basically preventing people from displaying Jawlani, now Shara's image on cars, on flags, banners, window signs, all of the kind of things that we have often seen in the Middle East. Anybody who's been to, Jordan or Lebanon or other countries knows that, these kind of banners, political slogans are often seen on billboards, on cars, you name it. And it's interesting that the new government showed a level of restraint and caution in not encouraging that kind of centralization or glorification of their leader. And I think that is, a response, of course, to the Assad regime plastering his face everywhere. And I think it's a very positive thing for Syria, because what Syria needs right now, as much as the charismatic authority that Shara might have could help in this interim period to keep the armed coalitions together, ultimately what Syria needs long term is a future that includes leaders from all different parts of Syrian society and is not just, dominated by a cult of personality around one person. And I think we're seeing early encouraging signs of that. Of course, as my colleagues have pointed out, and as I've written about elsewhere, this is something we need to keep watching and monitoring. It's not guaranteed, and certainly there are risks. But I think it's a very positive sign that at least so far, the new government and the groups have not tried to centralize authority and put a kind of cult of personality around this individual, because that's ultimately not in Syria's long-term interests, even if it helps in this kind of short interim period.
So I think it's one thing that's important to conclude from all these different insights and different developments politically in the region as well, vis-a-vis the new Syrian leadership and the other actors, as well as internally. I think one thing that's very clear is that there are factors that are very positive in terms of the stability of the new system. First of all, I think we have to conclude that the new leadership has held, so there wasn't an immediate falling apart despite all these different groups with different ideologies, backgrounds, and ideas for the country have gained that successful victory together. It seems to be stable for the time being. Then there is the element of al-Shara as the leader and the charismatic influence that a leader like that can have on a movement. Also, when it comes to people reporting grievances and resentments against al-Shara or other individual leaders in that movement, it's important to remember that these views can change over time. For example, the successful removal of Assad may have fundamentally changed people's view on what is now important and what is now worth fighting for, and also fighting for politically in that sense. So I think we can conclude that even though it's impossible in this context to make any specific prediction of what will happen with any sense of certainty, there are a lot of factors that the new Syria has going for it, and that could, cause someone to be optimistic about the prospects, as well as a number of factors that still remain unaddressed issues. We've addressed a lot of them in our discussion, and there remain a lot of issues around these divisions and ways of foreign influence by other actors in the region, as well as inside this movement, that may cause further tensions down the road.
Niels, I think you've highlighted a lot of really important sort of unresolved issues, open questions. And obviously, Syria's future is really just beginning, if you will. There's so many challenges ahead as we look forward towards transitional justice, things like economic development, geopolitics. How will the Trump administration in the White House shape things going forward in Syria? How will his relationship with Putin and other relationships in the region and other interests of regional countries influence the leadership of Syria and its future going forward? These are all things that obviously we can't answer yet, but through CEPT, we'll be continuing to do our research. We're going to be launching more surveys and more interviews, and we'll continue to collect data and analyze it and hope to share it with people in policy circles, with the general public, and with all of our listeners here. So first of all, I just want to thank my colleagues, both for being on this podcast and for all the work we've done together and the work we'll continue to do together. And I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. Please follow ICSR and CEPT on social media to stay up to date with not only this research, but so much other research we have going forward. And thank you again.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the Breaking Cycles of Conflict miniseries for the War Studies podcast. This episode was produced and edited by Zainab Mustafa and Clara May from the CEPT Research Programme at King's College London. To find out more about CEPT, please visit the link in the episode description. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your preferred podcast provider. It really helps us reach more listeners. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the War Studies podcast.